Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to part 2 of the story of James Earl Ray and the assassination of Martin Luther King. When we left you last, the intersection of these two men, one filled with hate and anger, the other with hope and love, came to be in Memphis, Tennessee, that home of the blues, a place named after the ancient Egyptian capital, a mysterious land of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids. And it is here in Memphis, Tennessee, that we continue our story.
Let's begin. Chapter 1. A Sick White Brother. On April 4th, 1968, James Earl Ray, pathological liar and wannabe pornographer, speed freak and intravenous drug user, bigot and violently racist white supremacist who once carried a picture of Hitler in his wallet, stood in the grime-streaked bathtub of a filthy flop house in Memphis, Tennessee. His Remington .30-06 Game Master rifle pointed out the window toward the celebrated Lorraine Motel, where Wilson Pickett had famously written the song, The Midnight Hour.
200 feet away and slightly below him, standing on the balcony, was Nobel Peace Prize recipient and civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a celebrated man of nonviolence, a reverend who traveled through India, learning the spiritual ways of civil disobedience. A man whose bravery in the face of death had fundamentally changed the world, giving freedom to many and hope to even more.
At 6:01 p.m., James Earl Ray fixed the Reverend in the sights of the Redfield variable scope and squeezed the trigger of his rifle.
The bullet traveled at a velocity of 2,670 feet per second, slamming into Dr. King's chin, shattering the jawbone. The soft-nosed projectile following the downward path went out the underside of his jaw and re-entered his body at the neck, slicing directly through the cinch of his tie. Traveling through his neck, it shattered his spine before embedding itself in his shoulder.
The impact of the bullet shoved Dr. King backwards. A fantail of blood sprang out and splashing the ceiling, splinters of his jawbone skittering across the balcony floor.
Dr. King grasped at his throat with his right hand, his left searching for the railing as he fell backwards, the wound gushing blood with his pulse, his unlit cigarette still gripped between the fingers of his right hand.
James Earl Ray saw the telltale aerosol spray of blood and knew he'd hit his target dead on. A perfect shot.
He hastily put his rifle back in the Browning box, wrapped it in a dirty green sheet, and grabbing his suitcase, tore out of the bathroom, down the hall and out the door, emerging onto South Main Street at 6:02 p.m. and headed down the cracked sidewalk to his car, parked 60 feet away.
All was eerily quiet. But as James strode down the sidewalk, passing Kinnip's Amusement Company, he noticed a commotion at the fire station on Mulberry Street. Several police officers running out, brandishing weapons.
Not wanting to be seen with a suspicious package, he decided to ditch the rifle, as well as his awkward suitcase, tossing them into the doorway of the amusement company before hurrying to his car.
James Earl Ray leapt into his 1966 Ford Mustang and screeched off, flying down the street so fast that witnesses inside the amusement company who saw him were unable to catch the license plate number.
As the car went speeding off, Lieutenant Judson Gomerly of the Shelby County Sheriff Department came running down the street with his pistol drawn, seconds too late.
Witnesses inside the amusement company told the lieutenant about the man who'd thrown the suitcase and sheet-wrapped box into the doorway before leaping into his car and tearing off. And within minutes, the first dispatch went out.
Suspect described as young white male, well-dressed, believed in late model white Mustang, going north on Main.
It was now 6:10 p.m.
Chapter 2, The Lorraine Motel.
Suddenly, the world I used to know, I see it differently. You woke me from a dream, now here's reality. Baby, baby, you are really hurting me. 'Cause every time you tell me
Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King's lieutenant and right-hand man, was splashing on aftershave and getting ready for the soul food feast when he heard the shot ring out. At first, he thought it was a car backfiring or a firecracker.
When he glanced out the half-open door of room 306, he saw Martin's wingtip shoes and thought for a moment he was instinctively ducking at the sound. Then, he saw the blood. He howled, "My God, Martin's been shot!" He darted out, ducking down, fearing the sniper might still be out there.
Ralph Abernathy knelt at his friend and mentor's side, caressing his cheek, hoping to comfort him, the wound worse than he'd imagined, a ragged and torn hole as large as a fist in his neck, bone glimmering within.
Martin gasped raspily, his lips seeming to form the word, "Oh," his eyes wobbling in their sockets.
"Martin," Ralph said, "it's all right, don't worry. This is Ralph. Ralph is here."
As Ralph Abernathy watched, Martin Luther King's skin went ashen. His lips turned blue as his blood pressure plummeted, his pupils dilating. As Ralph would later say,
the understanding drained from his eyes.
An undercover policeman there to spy on the invaders ran up with a motel towel and wrapped it around Martin's wounds. Jesse Jackson came racing up the stairs.
Inside room 306, Reverend Billy Kiles desperately tried to call an ambulance on the phone, but all the lines were busy, and he fell against the wall, weeping and screaming hysterically, pounding his fists. He then took a sheet and pillow and brought it out to King, and seeing the cigarette still clutched between his fingers, removed it, thinking Martin wouldn't want to be seen with it.
just let me know when I go.
Parking lot was pure pandemonium. Some believing a bomb had gone off. Firemen and police were pouring out of the fire station across the street, leaping over the retaining wall as people ran in all directions, weeping, screaming, cursing.
Lori Bailey, the co-owner of the motel, began shaking, moaning, why? The stress and grief causing a blood vessel in her brain to rupture, causing a massive cerebral hemorrhage. She collapsed to the floor and fell into a coma and would die in the hospital a few days later. Another victim to James Earl Ray's senseless act of violence and racism.
It's fucking crazy, isn't it?
I don't think I knew that had happened. That's wild.
As helmeted policemen came streaming out into the parking lot with their weapons drawn, many of Martin's entourage thought they were being attacked, that they were under siege. But then the police were yelling, "Where'd the shot come from? Where'd the shot come from?"
Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, and the others standing over his body all pointed up and to the right, to the moldering brick flop house, partially obscured by brush. Photographer Joe Lau snapping the iconic image that would immortalize the moment forever.
So many police radios were switched on that feedback erupted at the station, and the dispatcher started screaming for them to cut off some of the radios at the Lorraine Motel.
Fire Department Ambulance 401, a long-finned red Cadillac, screeched into the Lorraine courtyard, technicians leaping out and hauling a stretcher up to the balcony, sliding Dr. King onto it and administering oxygen with a portable tank.
As they loaded Martin into the ambulance, Ralph Abernathy leaped in as well. And then Senator Georgia Davis, in a daze, began to follow him before someone touched her shoulder and said softly, "I don't think you want to do that."
Suddenly she realized what she was doing. Yes, of course, it would not be a good look for Martin's mistress to be photographed in the ambulance.
It was now 6:09 as the ambulance raced to St. Joseph's Hospital.
Chapter 3, The Flop House.
The policeman who'd run down Main Street just in time to see James Ray speed away in his Mustang stared down at the bundle wrapped in a green sheet sitting in the doorway of Canopy's amusement company. Plainly, there was a rifle box within the dirty sheet.
He ordered the area sealed off, saying no one was to touch anything.
A line of police officers then advanced on the flop house. Drunk Charlie Stevens watching in awe out the window at the pandemonium, having no idea what was happening. He didn't even know Martin Luther King was staying next door.
Charlie told officers that the shot came from the bathroom, which was occupied by the new guy from room 5B.
Officers stormed into room 5B, using the bent coat hanger to enter. Inside the empty room, the bed still made. A chair sat by the open window, a breeze fluttering the curtains which had been pushed aside. Beneath the chair, there were the black leather straps of James's brand new binoculars, which had fallen out of the bag when he opened it.
They went to the filthy communal bathroom. The window was jammed open, the screen pushed out, the flashing police lights from the Lorraine Motel parking lot shimmering in. They noticed on the windowsill a fresh half-moon indentation where the rifle barrel had lain, and fresh scuff marks in the dirty bathtub.
Chapter 4, The Hospital.
Lately my thoughts got me distant. Darker days filling up darker minds. Stuck in this room that keeps spinning, wondering how you been, where you hide. Late night drink.
The doctors at St. Joseph Hospital did everything they possibly could to save the life of esteemed civil rights leader Martin Luther King. When he arrived, King still had a clear heartbeat and a radial pulse. 2 IVs were immediately attached to him, one of saline and one of blood.
He was given a tracheotomy and connected to a respirator. Ralph Abernathy watching it all, saying he wasn't leaving, though the nurses urged him to. A thoracic surgeon, a heart surgeon, a neurosurgeon, a pulmonary specialist, a renal specialist, and several general surgeons all converged in the operating room.
Through the gaping bullet wound, the size of a fist, they could clearly see the apex of his right lung, and that his spine had been completely shattered.
doctor turned to Abernathy, saying, "It would be a blessing if he did go. The spine is cut and he has sustained awful brain damage. He's brain dead."
As King's heartbeat grew weak, an EKG machine was used to shock his heart. He was then injected with adrenaline directly into the muscle of his heart, all while a physician performed closed-chest cardiac massage.
A doctor shined a light in King's eyes. The massively dilated pupils were completely unresponsive, and the doctor turned to Ralph Abernathy, saying, "He won't make it."
Then why, Ralph asked, are they still doing that?
"With somebody as important as Dr. King, you keep trying everything," the doctor stated. "But nothing's going to work now."
For 15 more minutes, doctors massaged King's heart, watching as the EKG needle moved slower and slower and slower until it stopped moving altogether, and a doctor told Ralph Abernathy,
"If you'd like to spend the last few moments with him, you can have them now."
Ralph Abernathy took his friend and mentor, Martin Luther King, father of 4, the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in history, crusader for the poor and downtrodden, into his arms, and held him as his breaths came slower and slower, and finally ceased to come at all.
7:05 p.m., April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead.
Chapter 5. The Getaway. Memphis police frantically searched for the fleeing Ford Mustang, pulling over every Mustang they saw, and there were a lot of them. It was an incredibly popular car, over 400 of them having been sold in Shelby County alone.
And then an utterly bizarre thing happened. And if there is a conspiracy, and conspiracy simply being defined as 2 or more people engaged in a secret plan, well, if there is a conspiracy, here is the smoking gun.
We briefly talked about closed band radios, or CBs, in our episode on long-haul trucker Keith Jesperson, the smiley face killer, mostly used by truckers and motorists to report local road conditions. In the late 60s, they were first beginning to become popular, and that night on Channel 17, a lesser-used frequency, suddenly there was a wild burst of activity.
On the CB radio, a man claiming to be in a blue Pontiac said he was following the white Mustang driven by the man who shot King, saying they were going east on Summer from Highland and that they were traveling at speeds of nearly 100 miles per hour, in and out of rush hour traffic, running red lights, as they drove into the far eastern outskirts of Memphis and towards Millington.
Police raced to eastern Memphis. Roadblocks were set up as the voice on the CB radio shouted, "He's shooting at me! He's hit my windshield!"
And then, at 6:48, the transmission completely ceased.
Investigators would soon realize that this wild high-speed chase and shootout never happened. It was a hoax. To this day, no one knows who was behind it. Was the CB transmission a prank? The caller sounded very young. Or was it a diversion?
As Memphis police poured into the east side of the city, James Earl Ray was actually headed south towards Mississippi on Highway 78, the same route he'd come in on, going right past the New Rebel Motel.
And by 6:30, James Earl Ray was in Mississippi, managing to stay literally miles and minutes from the dragnet which was encircling the city, closing streets and setting up roadblocks, searching for the white Mustang.
Chapter 6. Washington.
The FBI's code name for King was Zorro, and they'd spent more time and money following, wiretapping, bugging, and smearing his name than any other person in the history of the agency.
As an example of how torn and polarized the federal government and the nation were, when word came out that Zorro was dead, FBI agent Arthur Murdoch shook his head and said, "What a tragedy. He was a credible person. He was doing what he could to help people."
Standing right beside him, Agent James Rose said King was a commie, a charlatan, and a threat to the nation's security, saying King was trying to take over the country and give it to the Russians, and he was glad the son of a bitch was dead.
The two FBI agents fell into a furious argument, screaming at each other whether Martin Luther King was a patriot or a traitor.
And this was America in 1968.
And this polarization went all the way to the very top of the nation's law enforcement officials.
Attorney General Ramsey Clark was the first to be notified that King was officially pronounced dead. And it should have been him that told FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. But by now, the two men hated each other so much, they weren't even on speaking terms. So instead of informing Hoover, Clark instead told his assistant.
But the Attorney General, who was determined to find this killer, did want the power of the FBI to investigate the case. There was only one problem. Murder is not a federal crime. The FBI can't investigate a plain murder. That's a state's job. But the FBI could investigate a crime if it violated Martin's civil rights, which is what Clark planned to use to invoke an investigation. The FBI couldn't investigate it as a murder, but they could investigate it as a violation of civil rights.
So Hoover's assistant goes to him, and this is an actual quote. Hoover's assistant comes to him and says, "Some idiot shot Martin Luther King."
And the first thing Hoover said was, "Do not accept responsibility for this investigation. This is a local matter. Give them all the assistance and help they need, but they're in charge."
Clark says he wants us to take over the case.
Well, he would.
So Hoover was now tasked with finding the killer of a man he'd openly despised and tried to ruin, had literally tried to drive to suicide.
Yeah, Hoover is this stodgy ultra-conservative they call the old man, who hated King and everything he stood for. And his boss, the district attorney, is this young liberal who saw King as a saint. It's crazy.
But soon enough, catching the killer would be more than just solving the crime for Hoover. It would also become necessary to catch the culprit in order to prove the FBI themselves hadn't committed the crime.
Because immediately suspicion fell on the FBI. And to this day, members of King's own family believe the FBI were somehow involved in the murder, though there's actually never been any real evidence of that, just wild, unfounded rumors.
As Ramsey Clark would later say, quote, "The FBI's reputation was at stake, and there was nothing more important to Hoover than the Bureau's reputation. Hoover was afraid people were going to say he did it, so he was all for finding the killer. And from the start, you could feel it in the pace and seriousness of the people in the Bureau."
And so, the largest manhunt in American history took place. 3,500 FBI agents working on the case. Let me say that number again. 3,500 FBI agents. It's insane. And say what you want about the FBI, these guys are well-trained professionals. They are not fucking around. And there were thousands of them tasked with finding this killer.
When President Johnson heard of King's assassination, he was devastated in many ways. He'd just announced he'd not seek renomination and was desperately trying to heal the nation and end the Vietnam War before he left office. He knew this was a huge setback to whatever legacy he hoped to have.
For the first time in American history, the flags flew half-mast for a private citizen's death.
The entire world mourned.
Haile Selassie, the conquering lion of Judah, emperor of Ethiopia, stated,
It is with profound grief that we have learned the shocking news of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, whose valiant struggles for the cause of human dignity shall long be remembered by all peace-loving peoples.
In India, where King had traveled in his search for understanding in the ways of civil disobedience and nonviolence, the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi stated,
"His death is a setback to mankind's search for light. Violence has removed one of the great men of the world."
Robert Kennedy, who would soon himself be the victim to an assassin, was giving a campaign stop that happened to be before a mostly African-American audience in Indianapolis, and announced the assassination to the crowd on the cuff, improvising a eulogy and quoting Aeschylus.
Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon our heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God.
And everyone knew what was coming, what had happened in Watts, in Detroit, in Memphis. It was like a palpable force. Anger was coming. Rage was coming. Fires were coming.
Chapter 7. America on Fire.
While so many in the Black community were saddened and grief-stricken, there was also a raging anger, especially among the young radicals who stoked these flames of rage. The Congress of Racial Equality's Floyd McKissick told reporters, quote, "King was the last prince of nonviolence, and nonviolence is now a dead philosophy."
Stokely Carmichael told the press, "When white America killed Dr. King, she declared war on us. The rebellions that have been occurring around this country, that's just light stuff compared to what is about to happen."
An elderly church lady in Memphis, crippled with arthritis, came tearing out onto the street, saying she was ready to fight, ready to riot, saying, "The Lord has abandoned us."
Memphis prepared for, and this is a quote, "a racial apocalypse," which is so sad thinking Martin Luther King gave his life for racial harmony, and in the end he'd transcended race in his struggle and sought to include the downtrodden of all cultures and ethnicities in his cause.
All gas stations and liquor stores in Memphis were closed, a telling combination. Fear of drunk people starting fires. And the National Guard was called in. A strict curfew was put into effect, roadblocks set up, and shoot-to-kill orders to halt looters. And the Cotton Carnival, a weird old Confederate plantation ball put on by rich white people. The mayor's wife had actually been the queen once, and that was canceled. How utterly ironic.
Reverend Lawson went to the black radio station and told listeners, quote,
"It would be compounding of this death if people around our country should decide that now is the time to let loose an orgy of violence. It would be a denial of Dr. King's life and work. Stay calm, please."
In Washington, D.C., rainstorms swelled and water splashed from the skies, but as darkness fell, the rain didn't stop the rioters. That first rainy night in Washington, there were 18 fires and 200 stores looted. Riots also flaring up in Chicago, Baltimore, and New Jersey.
Yeah, my dad told me he was in Baltimore at the movies, seeing The Graduate, a great movie, one of my favorite movies. And in the middle of the movie, all the lights came on. And they announced on the intercom, "Dr. Martin Luther King has been assassinated," and there are riots breaking out. A curfew has been enforced. Go home.
The next night in Washington, there were more than 500 fires. The city going up in flames, the Washington Monument draped in smoke, an inferno just blocks from the Department of Justice.
Smoke crept into the White House, and President Johnson looked out the window, where in the distance, an immense pillar of fire burned. And Johnson said to his entourage,
"What did you expect when you put your foot on a man's neck and hold him down for 300 years, and then you let him up? What's he going to do? He's going to knock your block off."
The White House was reinforced with sandbags, surrounded by troops. Machine gun nests were erected throughout the Capitol.
There was fire and rioting in 150 American cities across the country, from Los Angeles to Baltimore. 40 people died, 21,000 people were arrested. It became known as the Holy Week Uprising.
Chapter 8: Manhunt.
The first thing the FBI did was take control of the bundle dropped into the doorway of the amusement store, which had been fastidiously guarded where it lay by a burly Memphis cop with a shotgun.
The thin bedspread looked like something from a cheap hotel, and the black cardboard box was for a Browning rifle. Yet inside it was a Remington Game Master 30-06, model 760, serial number 461476. It looked brand new, not a scratch on it.
There was also a box of ammunition, metal-jacketed Springfield high-velocity cartridges, 150 grain.
The small blue zippered suitcase was filled with odd random things. A magnetic tack hammer, a pair of pliers, dandruff shampoo, boxer shorts, a couple cans of Schlitz beer that had been taxed in Mississippi, a whole bunch of little soap bars from a motel bathroom, a pocket-sized Channel Master radio, 2 road maps with penciled markings on them, the front section of the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper with Martin Luther King's photograph standing forlornly on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in front of room 306, and a brand new pair of Bushnell binoculars with the actual receipt.
A veritable treasure chest of enticing clues.
Yeah, James Earl Ray really fucked up when he panicked and tossed that shit. You know he was kicking himself.
The bullet was recovered during the autopsy, appearing to be a .30-06, but it was mushroomed nearly beyond recognition, completely flattened after its long path through bone and flesh. It appeared to have the same right twist groove pattern as the rifle, but it was impossible to tell, as it had been too chipped and fractured to ascertain.
To this day, that bullet is discussed. A hotbed of conspiracy theories, some claiming it's not even a .30-06 bullet. But the truth is, it's just a deformed hunk of lead and isn't giving up any secrets.
They were quickly able to track down where the rifle had been purchased, the owner giving a detailed description of the strange man calling himself Harvey Laumeier.
The FBI's top fingerprint expert, George Bonebreak. What a name, Bonebreak. Love it. Who'd been working fingerprints since 1941, meticulously dusted everything, coming up with 6 high-quality prints from the rifle, binoculars, newspaper, and beer cans. Several from the left thumb, which gave an unmistakable ulnar loop of 12 ridge counts.
Bingo. A print. Now they just had to go through the 82 million individuals they had on file, by hand with a magnifying glass.
Yeah, fuck, man. Chapter 9. Georgia on my mind.
As James Earl Ray drove through Alabama, the heart of Dixie, he dreamed of going to Africa and joining the Rhodesian military to fight for apartheid and white supremacy. Rhodesia had no extradition treaties with the United States, and everyone spoke English. It was perfect.
And he was high, Russian, absolutely spun as can be, on the crime he just committed. Methamphetamine was nothing compared to the rush of murder.
But then he heard a newsflash come across the radio. Police were looking for a well-dressed man driving a white Ford Mustang. Shit, he'd been made.
So now he had a huge issue. His beloved car, his Ford Mustang, it was now the hottest damn car in America.
Deciding to abandon all his possessions in an effort to conceal himself and travel lighter, he pulled over and dumped all the equipment he'd bought to become a pornographer. The projector and splicer, an 8mm movie camera, sex toys he'd been lugging across the country, tossing the expensive equipment in a ditch and driving on.
And he thought of ditching the car too a few times, of catching a bus, but he decided to just drive slow and drift on into Atlanta, the birthplace and home of the man he just murdered in cold blood. And he parked the car at a housing project called Capitol Homes between a mountain of trash and a crumbled and broken playground slide.
And there he left his beloved vehicle, something he most likely loved more than any person, besides himself, of course.
At 8:41, James Earl Ray flagged down United Cab Company driver Chuck Stevens on Memorial Drive and asked to be brought to the Greyhound station in Atlanta. There, he bought a ticket to Detroit, Michigan, and having a few hours to spare, darted to his rooming house to grab his .38 revolver and some clothes.
He actually took the time to send his final payment to locksmithing correspondence school. He was now an official locksmith. Leaving his beloved Zenith portable television, which he'd been lugging all over the country, as well as his typewriter, he headed back to the bus station.
What do you want to be, a moonlight yag? Soon, James Earl Ray was sitting pretty on a Greyhound bus, motoring through Knoxville, Tennessee, and into Kentucky, out of the deep south and into Ohio, headed north to Michigan and the Canadian border.
Chapter 10. When the hunter becomes the prey.
James Earl Ray, who'd silently stalked Martin Luther King across the country, hunting him down, was now the prey, as over 3,000 FBI agents took to searching for him.
The FBI was able to trace the pliers in the blue suitcase to a hardware store on 5542 Hollywood Boulevard, Los Angeles, California. Also, inside a pair of boxer shorts, they found a tiny laundry tag labeled O2B6. This clue also led them to Los Angeles, so the investigation spread out from Memphis to Southern California.
In Memphis, FBI agents fanned out to all the hotels, eventually coming upon the New Rebel, where they learned one Eric S. Galt of Birmingham, Alabama, had checked in the day before the assassination, driving a white Ford Mustang, license plate number 138993.
They tracked down Eric Galt's driver's license, occupation merchant seaman, then using the VIN number found the former owner of the Mustang, who told them about the very nondescript-looking man who'd happily paid $1,995 cash for the car, noting how clean it was.
They now had 3 names: Eric Galt, Harvey Lohmeyer, and John Willard. And they worked at running the names down in every known place that there was. Voter registration list, parole board list, telephone directories, utility company records, rental car agencies, airlines, everything. And by hand, too. Obviously no internet in 1968.
When James had abandoned his beloved Mustang, a woman named Mary Bridges watched him park the car and walk away, never to return. It seemed suspicious. There were Mexican Turista stickers on the vehicle, And who abandons a nice car like that by a pile of trash in a housing project? The guy had even looked suspicious, like a spy. Something about him had made her think he had a gun on him.
Hearing all the talk of the white Mustang on the news, she called the FBI, who, amazingly, just blew her off. Told her to call the local police. And she did. Was transferred to the auto theft division, who ran the plates and said, well, it wasn't stolen. And that was that.
But a random detective happened to hear. He went and checked it out and alerted the FBI, who then swarmed on the vehicle like ants on cake crumbs.
They traced the vehicle back to an oil change in Los Angeles, and from there to the St. Francis Hotel on Hollywood Boulevard. They were on his trail like bloodhounds. The hotel supplied them with a list of all the phone calls he'd made from the room.
Using the phone records, they tracked down women James had attempted to use in pornographic films, as well as members of the George Wallace for President campaign, who told them about his cheap suits and fake alligator shoes, saying he was a strange loner who never smiled or looked you in the eye.
They tracked him to dance lessons, the locksmithing school, and then to the International School of Bartending, where they got a picture of him graduating, clenching his eyes shut and grimacing.
A photograph. Bingo. There he was for the world to see, looking like an idiotic numbskull in a cheap tux making a ridiculous face.
And in Georgia, agents tracked Eric Galt to the rooming house in Atlanta. And thinking he might return, the FBI agents went undercover as hippies, with beads and bell-bottoms, wearing wigs, and they rented a room in the rooming house, covertly breaking into James's room, examining the Zenith television and typewriter he'd left behind.
A warrant was issued for Eric Starvo Galt, aka Harvey Lohmeyer, aka John Willard. Taking the photograph from bartending school, an artist drew in the eyes, very creepy looking, making the picture almost look fake.
Chapter 11. Run, Rabbit, Run.
James Earl Ray stepped off the Greyhound bus and onto the streets of Detroit, where he cleaned himself up, got a shave, hailed a taxi, and crossed the Canadian border. Easy peasy.
It's crazy, you just get in a cab across the Canadian border. Yeah. He had the cabbie drop him off at the Canadian National Railways in Windsor, and he took a train to Toronto, Canada's largest city.
He rented a room from an old Polish lady for $8 a week, a needlepoint on the wall of a crucified Jesus saying, "Home sweet home."
He paid in cash, and the old lady didn't even ask him his name.
James holed up, leaving only to buy newspapers and pastries, watching television nonstop. Ramsey Clark appeared on Meet the Press, saying the killer would be caught, but it seemed like they had nothing.
The old Polish lady began to think her tenant was odd. He was up all day and night watching television. He appeared paranoid and worried, scared. She wondered if he wasn't from the mental institution down the street.
James Earl Ray went to Toronto's Evening Telegram newspaper, saying he wished to look at back issues from the 1930s, and they led him to a microfilm machine where he trolled for baby boys' births, coming across the name Raymond George Snide, born October 8th.
He found the man's address, cased the joint, and got a good look at him. He didn't look that different from him. Dark hair, fair skin, perfect.
James then bought some makeup that he used to give form to his unnaturally pale face, trying to modify his eyebrows, and then put on a pair of horn-rimmed glasses, went to Arcade Photo Studio, and had passport photos taken.
He then went to the Kennedy Travel Bureau and inquired about plane tickets to London. And this is crazy. When he told the travel agent he didn't have his passport yet, but that he was working on it, she told him that she could expedite the entire process, acting as his guarantor, and have the passport sent right there to the travel agency.
He didn't need a birth certificate or proof of residence or a character witness. For a $5 fee, she'd be his guarantor that he was a legitimate Canadian citizen, and the passport would be there in 2 weeks.
He made one fatal mistake, though. Bad handwriting. When he'd fill out the forms, his scrawled writing made the name appear Snea, not Snade.
To celebrate, he then went to a brothel on Condor Avenue, and then to a go-go club called the Silver Dollar, where he sipped Canadian whiskey and watched the girls dance.
But James's luck and happiness gave way the next day when newspapers around the world displayed his bartending school photograph on the front page. He consoled himself that it was a bad picture, his eyes clenched shut, taken before he'd gotten plastic surgery to augment his nose.
But when the old Polish lady who ran the boarding house saw it, she thought the photograph looked very much like her boarder and thought about calling the police. But her husband told her she was, quote, crazy in the head.
And when she went to go check on this mysterious boarder, he was gone.
Chapter 12, Palm Sunday.
On Palm Sunday, 1968, 42,000 people gathered in Memphis, headed by Martin Luther King's widow, Coretta, and 3 of their children, Yolanda, Martin III, and Dexter, beside her, to conduct the march that King had planned.
King's son Dexter would later say, "The people were kind, yet Memphis seemed like a forbidding place, a different evil kingdom where my father was killed."
This time, there was no violence at the march. In fact, it was completely silent. No singing, no chanting, no clapping of hands. Just the sound of marching feet moving down Beale Street.
Reverend Lawson had meticulously planned the march, organizing hundreds of marshals, many of them members of the invaders. Lawson telling the young militants,
"Each of you is on trial today. People from all over the world will be watching. Carry yourselves with dignity."
While many American cities rioted and were set ablaze, all was quiet and peaceful in Memphis, the home of the blues.
The march was solemn. Celebrities, both black and white, marching. Sammy Davis Jr. beside Dr. Benjamin Spock. Even a staunch local Republican councilman who said,
"I am a right-wing Republican. I've never liked labor unions, but it was decency that said, you get your old South End in that march, to hell with the country club."
Ted Kennedy was there, as was Rosa Parks, the first lady of civil rights, who'd sparked the freedom movement back in 1955 by refusing to go to the back of the bus.
The sky was dark and a mist of rain occasionally fell, but periodically the sun shone through the ebony clouds lighting their way.
Just 2 days later, 150,000 people gathered at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, following a team of Georgia farm mules, pulling an old wooden wagon, carrying the casket of polished African mahogany with Dr. Martin Luther King inside. King's lieutenants, including Ralph Abernathy, wore blue denim to symbolize the hard rural people they represented with the poor people's army.
120 million people watched from around the world, all 3 networks covering the event live. Schools, unions, banks, government offices all closed, and for the first time in history, the New York Stock Exchange closing for a private citizen's death. Even the roulette wheels in Las Vegas stopped spinning for 2 hours.
The mourners there in Atlanta represented all strata of America. 47 congressmen, 23 senators, a diverse assortment of statesmen and celebrities, from Jackie Kennedy and Richard Nixon to Marlon Brando and Paul Newman, to Aretha Franklin, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Dizzy Gillespie, Ray Charles, and Harry Belafonte.
After a long eulogy at Morehouse College, eventually the mule-drawn carriage made its way to Southview Cemetery, founded in the 1860s by proud African Americans tired of having to use the rear entrance of the city graveyard. There, it would wait until a permanent memorial could be constructed.
Ralph Abernathy, clothed in blue denim, was on a spiritual fast, hadn't eaten since the assassination, and spoke, tears streaming down his face. The grave is too narrow for his soul. We thank God for giving us a leader who was willing to die, but not willing to kill.
Chapter 13. Who is James Earl Ray?
As J. Edgar Hoover and his assistant Deloach pored over the information coming in about their suspect, a pattern began to appear. And it appeared to them that this Eric Galt was already on the run. The aliases, the flop houses, always paying with cash, constantly on the move. So they decided to focus the fingerprint search on wanted men, men on the run, which brought the list down from the millions to 53,000. Still a big number, but significantly smaller.
Then, to their great pleasure, they realized that of those 53,000, only 1,900 had thumbprints with loops of between 10 and 14 ridge counts.
Fingerprint experts from Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, and Richmond were flown in to assist as they worked around the clock with their magnifying glasses. Yes, they're hand-looking at the prints with magnifying glasses.
And the very next day, they found a match on the 702 card. A habitual offender and escapee from the Jeff City, Missouri State Penitentiary by the name of James Earl Ray.
James Earl Ray, born on March 10th, 1928, in Alton, Illinois, the son of George Ellis Ray and Lucille Ray, and the eldest of 9 siblings.
The Ray family had lived a life of crime and squalor for over 100 years. Ray's great-grandfather was a, quote, all-around thug who sold liquor to Indians off the back of a wagon and was hanged after gunning down 6 men.
Ray's beloved Uncle Earl was a traveling carnival boxer and convicted rapist who served a 6-year sentence for throwing carbolic acid into his wife's face.
Ray's father, known variously as Great Dane and Speedy, had been born in 1899 and was a man constantly on the run, always trying to evade the law, changing the family name from Ryan to Raines to Ray so many times the children didn't even know their real name. Between crime sprees, he worked as a railroad brakeman and junk hauler before abandoning the family.
Ray's 6-year-old sister Marjorie had burned to death playing with matches. His brother Buzzy had driven his car off a bridge at 18 and drowned.
Ray's mother drank herself to death at 51.
And at 12 years old, Ray dropped out of school to pursue a life of crime.
The police chief in Alton described him as a, quote, thief who slept all day and stole all night.
In one heist, he fell out of his own car during a turn after failing to shut the door.
Dirt poor, uneducated, he had nothing but his white skin, which he came to believe made him superior. At 16, he started carrying a picture of Hitler in his wallet and preaching of white supremacy.
The end of World War II, he joined the army and was stationed in Germany, but was soon discharged for, quote, ineptness and lack of adaptability for military service.
Ray's first conviction for criminal activity was a burglary in California in 1949, shortly after being kicked out of the Army.
In 1952, he served 2 years for the armed robbery of a taxi driver in Chicago, where his brother had moved. In 1955, he was convicted of mail fraud after stealing money orders in Hannibal, Missouri, and locked up in the federal United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth for 4 years.
In 1959, he was caught in the armed robbery of a Kruger store in St. Louis. which was the nail in his coffin legally.
He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for repeated offenses. In prison, he constantly talked of escape, earning himself the nickname the Mole, and became a known supplier and user of crystal methamphetamine.
He also told folks that once he escaped, he planned on killing Martin Luther King, saying it was his retirement plan, that he'd be a beloved hero.
After meticulous planning and years of preparation, training himself to contort up into a ball and stay perfectly still for hours, bribing all the right people with his meth money, he was able to secrete himself into a crate of bread at the prison's bakery, consuming a dozen hard-boiled eggs beforehand, knowing he might not eat again for a while, and bringing with him his prison-issued Channel Master pocket radio that the FBI would find a year later in his suitcase tossed in an amusement company entryway.
The FBI went out searching for his family, finding his sister Melba, who'd constantly been in and out of mental institutions, was known for screaming profanities at strangers and dragging a 7-foot cross down Main Street.
When the FBI interviewed her about her older brother, all she said was, "He liked being clean. He always kept his hair combed."
Helpful. His brother John ran the Grapevine Tavern in South St. Louis, Missouri, a block away from the Wallace for President campaign headquarters. Like his brother, John, too, was an avowed racist and criminal who'd served 7 years for armed robbery, the tavern name itself a reference to the prison grapevine of communication.
John was most certainly involved in James's criminal life, had most likely helped him escape from prison and robbed a bank with him afterwards, and many, including the FBI, believed he could have been involved in the assassination of King as well. Just how involved is really unknown. Like his brother, he was a liar, and he was also a drunk, which further complicates everything, as he'd get wasted and say all kinds of crazy shit.
Chapter 14. Rabbit Stew.
James Earl Ray found new lodgings with a Chinese woman named Sun Feng Lu, who had no television, didn't speak English, so he holed up, waited patiently for his passport and plane tickets, his money slowly dwindling, listening to the radio compulsively.
And then an America's Most Wanted bulletin came over the airwaves. The FBI was now in search of a man named James Earl Ray, 40 years old, 5 foot 10 inches tall, 174 pounds, may have fled to Mexico or Canada. Cash reward of $100,000. Consider him armed and dangerous.
In a panic, James decided to flee Toronto and went to Montreal, prowling the shipyards, hoping to find a freight to take him to South Africa. And he actually found one, but they wouldn't take him without a passport.
So he returned to Toronto, where his passport and plane tickets were waiting, noticing, to his great consternation, that the passport was made out to Snea, not Snade, because of his poor handwriting.
But that didn't stop him from going to the Toronto International Airport and boarding British Overseas Airways Flight 600, which took him to London's Heathrow Airport.
James Earl Ray was now in swinging London.
Chapter 15. The Poor People's Army.
King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, went forward with its plan for a poor people's encampment in Washington, D.C., and secured a month-long permit from the National Park Service to build a sprawling encampment on 16 acres of the mall in West Potomac Park between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah, you have the right to protest on federal land. That's your right, and that's how national rainbow gatherings exist. They're all held in national forests under this same concept.
The SCLC promoted it as its greatest nonviolent demonstration since Gandhi's Salt March, naming the area Resurrection City. But unfortunately, the event was doomed in many ways.
On May 21st, 1968, approximately 3,000 people descended on Washington, D.C. and set up camp in the sprawling shantytown that they had named Resurrection City, an area so large it was given its own zip code. Masses of the destitute, a poor people's army, just as Martin Luther King had envisioned it. African Americans joining with poor whites from Appalachia, Hispanics from Los Angeles, Native American tribes from across the country, all demanding an economic Bill of Rights, including a basic minimum wage and health care.
But right from the beginning, there was trouble.
Living conditions in the shantytown were squalid, and there were tensions over leadership. Escaped mental patients ran amok through the camp, causing all kinds of problems. Teenage gangs roamed about, beating up reporters and robbing folks. An obese man with an axe ran around hacking down tents. A phone booth was set on fire. A group of rowdies throwing bottles at cars had to be taken down by riot police and tear gas. And undercover FBI agents did their best to disrupt and discredit the movement.
Ralph Abernathy did his best, but without King's leadership and discipline, it was all rocky. And the truth is, maybe even King himself might not have been able to make it work. Historians speculate that if King had lived, his legacy could have been overshadowed by failures, like this as well as the riot during the Memphis March. Many historians also say the same thing about President John F. Kennedy, that if he lived, he would most likely be known as the one that led us into Vietnam.
Then it started to rain, and rain, and rain, and rain for 2 weeks straight, till the water was ankle deep and ice cold, a mud hole, a literal quagmire.
By June 24th, when the permit ended, there were only 500 stubborn people left in Resurrection City out of the original 3,000, and riot police stormed in, arresting 288 of them, Ralph Abernathy among them.
No economic Bill of Rights ever came to pass, and the Poor People's Army became known as the, quote, Little Bighorn of the Civil Rights Movement, a place of historical defeat.
Chapter 16, Portugal.
After landing in London, James Earl Ray was able to refund his round-trip fare for a flight to Portugal, where he holed up in Lisbon, hoping to catch a freighter to South Africa. But again, he was thwarted by bureaucracy, as he needed to get a visa, which could take weeks.
He spent the evenings in shady seaside bars, spending his dwindling funds on prostitutes. He went to the Canadian consulate and had a new passport issued with the name corrected, then decided to head back to London, thinking an English-speaking country would be the best place to commit some crimes and make some much-needed money.
In London, using the same revolver he'd been lugging through Mexico and across the country and had hidden in an Atlanta flophouse, he attempted to rob a jewelry store ran by an elderly couple. But the sweet old lady leapt onto his back while her husband set off the alarm and then began to pummel him, James having to flee empty-handed, lucky to just get away.
Back in Canada, the FBI was asking authorities to go over all recent passport applications, which they dutifully did, and a young constable, meticulously checking each new passport photo with a magnifying glass, came across the photograph of James Ray. Something about it caught his eye, and the real Raymond Sneyd was contacted and did not know anything about a new passport being issued.
A lot of this crime is solved with magnifying glasses. Fucking old school.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
On June 4th, James Ray robbed a trustee savings bank in Fulham, West London, making off with a paltry $250.
Already familiar with the dark streets of London, he bought some speed and heroin, as well as a syringe, went to a cheap hotel in Pimlico, and shot up, cramming the syringe down the sink drain when he was done.
And the assassination of Robert Kennedy was now all over the news, and a hotel employee said to him, "It's terrible news about Senator Kennedy."
"It's terrible, all right," James replied back, his voice dripping in sarcasm. "Terrible."
Through dogged determination, James was finally able to get in touch with a Rhodesian mercenary named Major Wicks, with a commando unit in the Belgian Congo. But the major cryptically told him London was not the place to get information on being a mercenary for white supremacy, to go to Brussels, Belgium, and inquire there.
So James Ray headed back to the airport, determined to head to Brussels.
Meanwhile, the Canadian passport had been tracked back to London, and Scotland Yard was on the job. They issued an all-ports warning which read, "Raymond Sneyd, wanted for serious immigration matter. Do not interrogate, but detain."
At the airport, James Earl Ray prepared to board Flight 466 to Brussels, Belgium. At immigration, an officer asked for his passport, and James showed it to him. All seemed in order, but as the officer was handing the passport back, he noticed another passport peeking up from James's pocket.
"What's that passport then, eh?" he asked.
James fished it out, clearly marked "cancelled," and showed it to him, explaining how it had been issued in the wrong name due to his bad handwriting. And as the two talked, an airport detective strolled up, recognizing James from the recent bulletin.
"I say, old fella," the detective said, "would you mind stepping over here? May I took a look at those passports, old chap?"
Soon, 2 uniformed police officers were there as well, and the detective asked James if he could pat him down just for safety's sake.
And when he did, he found James Earl Ray's revolver. It's crazy you could just stroll in and out of airports everywhere with a gun on you. Like, no one... He'd flown, from Canada into England, all the down to Portugal, back up to England. Time he had a pistol in his pocket.
It's wild.
And it was, of course, that same 38 that he carried through Mexico and Los Angeles and hidden in the Atlanta boarding house. A Japanese-made 38 caliber Liberty Chief, a walnut stock wrapped in electrical tape, fully loaded.
The airport detective asked him,
"Why are you carrying this weapon then, eh?"
"I'm going to Africa. I thought I might need it. You know how things are there."
"Well, mate, appears to me, in having this weapon, you have committed an arrestable offense and are going to be detained."
Chapter 17. The jig is up.
James Earl Ray, insisting his name was Raymond Sneyd, was arrested for possession of a gun without a permit and brought to Cannon Road Jail, a granite cell block within Scotland Yard.
He was stripped, put in prison clothes, and brought to a cell. A few minutes later, Detective Chief Superintendent Thomas Butler entered the cell and said,
"As a result of inquiries made since you were detained, we have very good reason to believe you are not a Canadian citizen, but an American. I believe your name is not Sneyd, but James Earl Ray, also known as Eric Starvo Galt and other names, and that you are wanted at present in the United States for serious criminal offenses, including murder."
It had been 65 days since the assassination of Martin Luther King.
When Hoover was informed that their man had been caught, the old man simply replied, "Fine, prepare the press release."
Hoover briefed Attorney General Ramsey Clark on the matter, saying,
"This Ray is not a fanatic, but he is a racist and detested Martin Luther King. He had information about King speaking in other towns, but then picked out Memphis. I think he acted entirely alone, but we are not closing our minds that others might be associated with him. We have to run down every lead."
Clark, too, believed that he acted alone, but acknowledged that conspiracy theories would never go away, saying, "Some Americans don't want to believe that one miserable person can bring such tragedy on our country and impact so powerfully on the destiny of us all."
In London, James Earl Ray continued to insist he was a Canadian citizen named Raymond Sneed, though he asked for his brother Jerry Ray. Like, what the fuck? I'm not the guy you're looking for, but I'd like to talk to his brother, please.
Back in America, the KKK's United Klans of America raised $10,000 for Ray's defense, and proud white supremacist lawyer J.B. Stoner, chairman of the National State Rights Party, called James Ray a national hero deserving of the Congressional Medal of Honor and said he'd proudly defend him for free.
Ugh.
Yeah, fuck that guy wicked hard. On July 18th, Scotland Yard officially handed their prisoner over to the FBI at the U.S. Air Force Base in Lakenheath, Suffolk, in a secret transfer dubbed Operation Landing.
After being quickly examined by a physician, James was harnessed into a seat in a C-135 jet with 4 FBI agents and whisked away across the pond to the States, still insisting he was a Canadian citizen named Raymond Sneed. Yet now, he tacked a lord onto the name. He was a Lord Raymond Sneed.
Fucking nut job. During the trip, he'd pretend to sleep, yet the agents noticed that every few minutes he'd open one eye and stare about, playing a bizarre game of peekaboo.
He was flown to Millington Naval Base, 17 miles north of Memphis. There in Tennessee, he knew the jig was up and admitted that he was, in fact, James Earl Ray.
He was remanded to the sheriff's custody, and because of fears of an attack by black militants trying to kill him, or the KKK or Nazis trying to free him, or even possible co-conspirators trying to silence him, he was taken in absolute secrecy in an armored personnel carrier designed to take a rocket attack to the criminal courts building, armed guards on the roof, riot control police lining the street, and placed into a cell within a cell, specially prepared at a cost of $100,000. The windows covered with quarter-inch steel plates, multi-directional microphones and cameras installed within, bright fluorescent lights that burned 24 hours a day. At the same time he was being transported to the criminal courts building, a decoy convoy was headed to the Memphis airport to deter any possible attackers.
He was the most heavily guarded man in America. After going through a procession of lawyers, including the Nazi Stoner, James Earl Ray pleaded guilty in order to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to 99 years.
But just 3 days after taking the plea deal, he changed his story, saying the murder had been ordered by the mafia and committed by a mysterious figure known only as Raoul.
Ray said yes, he had bought the gun and he had bought the binoculars and checked into the flophouse, but it wasn't him who'd actually pulled the trigger. It was Raoul who'd met him there at the flophouse.
He couldn't provide a last name, an address, or phone number, or a single person who had ever met him, or even seen the two of them together. But it didn't explain why only his prints were on the rifle, or why it was only him who'd been seen at the flophouse. But conspiracy theorists have latched onto this theory from the moment he said it and never let it go.
Psychiatrists say James Earl Ray suffered from, quote, duping delight, that he experienced great joy at misleading and lying to people, even those that were trying to help him. And he was just delighted when he could send folks down crazy conspiratorial rabbit holes.
Chapter 18, 1977.
On June 10th, 1977, James Earl Ray again escaped from prison.
He was being held in the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, Tennessee's tightest maximum security prison.
A staged fight broke out in the yard, drawing the attention of the guards. And at the same exact time, James and 7 other men retrieved half-inch plumbing pipes they had hidden in their clothes, screwing them all together into a makeshift ladder and grappling hook. They used to hook onto and scale the 13-foot tall walls, then having to shimmy beneath electrified razor wire at the top. And just one wrong move, they'd be electrocuted.
At the same time, the phone lines to the prison went out.
Within minutes, the largest fugitive search in Tennessee history was underfoot. 150 men combing the hills and hollers.
For the second time, James Earl Ray was again on the FBI's 10 most wanted list.
Many, including Ralph Abernathy, claimed the escape itself was proof of a massive conspiracy.
But Ray was tracked down by bloodhounds. Yay, shout out to bloodhounds. 54 hours later, covered in blackberry scratches and poison oak welts, drenched and haggard.
The bloodhound handler, I happened to notice, said that he rewarded the bloodhounds by massaging their lips after they found them.
That's so funny. Just a little side note for anyone who's interested in the conversations of your co-hosts here prior to this episode being recorded. Christa was complaining to Matt about her part bloodhound's jowls.
In prison, sharing syringes with the other drug users, James Ray contracted hepatitis C, which slowly started to destroy his liver and kidneys.
In 1993, 25 years after the assassination, Lloyd Jowers, who'd owned the diner below the infamous Flophouse on Main Street, claimed he'd been part of the conspiracy to kill King, and that the mysterious Raoul character was in fact real.
This was at a moment when there was a lot of renewed interest in the case. Oliver Stone was actively pursuing making a film about it, and it's believed that this Lloyd Jowers was just looking to cash in on the publicity. In fact, there's an actual recording of him stating as much. And he offered absolutely no tantalizing proof, but his story was seized upon by conspiracy theorists, including King's own family.
Martin's son, Dexter Scott King, even visited James Earl Ray in prison, saying he thought he was innocent. That's wild.
I know, there's photographs of him. It's kind of... it's hard to look at, man. This guy killed your dad. You're there. I don't know. I think he killed his dad.
Yeah.
King's estate, then claiming Jowers was part of this conspiracy, sued Jowers for wrongful death in civil court for a symbolic $100. And they won. And they claimed that this proved that the entire assassination had been a massive conspiracy between the mafia and the FBI, as well as various law enforcement and government agencies.
But there is no real proof of this, no tangible evidence.
Yet, prompted by all the claims of conspiracy, in 1998, United States Attorney General Janet Reno ordered a new investigation. And on June 9th, 2000, the United States Department of Justice released a 150-page report rejecting any allegation that there was a conspiracy to assassinate King. Not that I trust Janet Reno that much, but
Yeah. James Earl Ray died of liver and kidney failure by complications of hepatitis C on April 23rd, 1998.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of James Earl Ray and the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thanks as always for listening.
And you got a case you'd like us to cover, or you got some music you want us to play, you just want to say hi, reach out to us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening.